Welcome to the Tennessee Smart Yards program on managing soils and mulch. In this program, we're going to be talking about soils and mulch, one of the components of the foundational 9 principles of the Tennessee Smart Yard. It'll help Tennessee homeowners do a better job in terms of managing their landscape for reduced environmental impacts, reducing water runoff, and basically improving the overall ecology of our environments. In this segment of the program, we're going to be talking about 4 components that really inch you towards a Tennessee Smart Yard. And if you're keeping up with your yardstick and kind of looking at those principles to kind of inch towards a smarter yards, some of those things that we'll be talking about here today in this program, we'll be talking on soil compaction and addressing soil compaction, how to use organic material and mulches, what is the correct amount of mulch to put on those trees and plants, and then basically in general protecting all soil surfaces with vegetation to minimize runoff and improve that soil health and soil quality. You know, soil, a lot of times people refer to it as dirt, but I like to tell homeowners that dirt's generally what you find under your fingernails. What we're trying to focus here is on soil and improving soil, because soil is a living basic environment that hosts a lot of fungi, bacteria, and other things, as well as serve as that anchoring point for our vegetation in our home landscapes. A lot of times we don't think about the soil being a filter, but that's exactly what it is. It's a filter that soaks in water, that cleans that water as it moves towards our ground layer, as it anchors those plants in, and it also absorbs and holds that water to reduce those runoffs that might impair our streams and other segments of our environment. So soil has a very, very important function, and one of those things that we really don't need to take for granted. And one of those aspects in terms of a smart yard or smart landscape that we need to put some energy and time into thinking about replenishing and protecting that soil environment. Soils are really complicated, and I've already kind of basically mentioned a few things about the complexity of soil in terms of water, airspace, the mineral components of sand, silt, and clay, the bacteria or other fungi that might live in that soil. So there's a lot of different components in that soil environment that really makes it alive, its own little ecology system, and very important to sustaining life here on Earth. One of my favorite quotes of all time is that one saying where we basically owe our entire existence to a 6-inch layer of soil and the fact that it rains that can help us sustain a lot of things here in terms of life on Earth. If we go and start breaking down a little bit of the composition of the soil profile that you'd find in your landscape, we're all very familiar with the fact that it's made up of those mineral components of sand and silt and clay. But a lot of times we fail to realize that there's an even bigger component of our soil that helps sustain that overall life, and that's water and air. Water and air comprise basically 50% of a soil's composition, and it's going to be critical, and I'll mention a little later on that moving that water and air through the soil profile is one of those things that's going to help us maintain life within that system. Now, mineral particles, as I've mentioned, sand, silt, and clay will make up approximately 45% of that composition, and the remaining 5% typically can be broken down into organic matter, which consists of roots, those organisms I've already mentioned, humus, so comprising about 5% of our soil profile, and overall making up 100% of that soil environment. Okay, so I've mentioned a couple of times talking about the mineral components of soil. We're basically mentioning sand, silt, and clay. And this illustration kind of gives you a concept of the size of each of those particles within that soil profile. We all have an idea how big gravel is, And if we wanted to compare gravel to the actual size of those mineral components, obviously you see sand is considerably smaller than gravel, but considerably larger than what we see of silt and clay. We think of silt a lot of times as being the very, very small particles in our soil, and it is a small particle, but as you can see in contrast to clay, silt is actually a larger component, a bigger particle than what we see in those clay particles. I'll discuss here in just a moment a simple home demonstration. It kind of illustrates the size of those different components. Now, on the screen, you're looking at what's called the soil triangle. And all of our soils in the state of Tennessee, and really across the United States, can fall somewhere within this soil triangle. And you can see that the soil triangle, basically the top portion there, clay, makes up the largest kind of size area of this entire triangle, with silt down in the far right corner being a smaller component and sand to the far left side of the screen being an even smaller component. Now, when we start thinking about our soils across the state, all of our soils will fall basically somewhere inside of this triangle based upon the percentages of the breakdown of the soil material content. And when we start talking about those percentages, probably if we're going to grow plants or we're looking towards the ideal soil, that would be in the center of your screen there, circled as a loam soil. Loams are those soils that are basically 40% silt, 40% sand, and 20% clay. This is an excellent soil for growing about any type of vegetation and plant that we would want to grow. And these soils typically filter water extremely well. Water and air move through these soils. Now, that's not to say the other soils are bad, but different components, as we increase the percentage of clay or the percentage of sand or even the percentage of silt, we can run into different issues where maybe the soil holds water very, very tightly, but it doesn't give up that water to plants. That would be clay. Or silt, it's maybe real soft and very textured, but very suspect to erosion via either wind or rain. Or in the bottom left, when we have extra high components of sand, that soil may be very, very loose, and air and water may move through it very quickly and easy. But in the case of water, it may move through so fast that those soils tend to be drouthy. So we actually like to have a blend of those. And again, that loam at 40% silt, 40% sand, 20% clay is an excellent, excellent combination for growing about any plant. And for the most part in Tennessee, most of our soils would fall into a loam, but depending upon where you're at in the state, you definitely may have higher clay contents, you may have higher silt contents, or you could possibly even have higher sand contents within your soil. Now, if you're wanting to know what kind of soil do I have? Well, there's a couple of simple tests that we can do out in our own lawn using our tools of shovel and those things that we keep with us most every day, and that's our fingers. We can take a bit of soil from the top 6 inches of our soil, and I'll talk a little bit about that plow layer here in a second, but take a little bit of soil from that top layer, put it in our hand, add a little bit of moisture to it, and kind of rub that soil in between our thumb and our fingers just to get an idea of that texture of soil. Now, obviously, the more sand that we have in that, the more gritty it will feel. If we have a lot of silt in it, it'll be a soft, kind of somewhat slick kind of feel to it. And if we have clay, the higher the clay content, it will feel more sticky. It will feel very firm. And as we moisten it even more, it'll truly be slick to a point that it'll actually give off a mirror shine when we look at that soil. But So if we want to go further in terms of testing that soil texture, we can actually, again, that moisten soil, roll it up into a ball and press on that ball. If that soil is primarily more of a sand, you'll probably have a hard time even getting it to form a ball. And any slight pressure, it'll actually crumble and just break completely away. If it's more of that medium texture, falling more into that lines of that loam that we've talked about, it'll hold some pressure to it, but as you apply pressure to it at greater content, you'll see it kind of starting to break apart and then ultimately crumble. If it's more high in terms of the clay content, it will be very firm to the press. It'll be a very tight, hard ball. And so that clay content, those very small particles, can really compress in very densely and tightly to form a hard ball. The ribbon test that's illustrated here is one of those things that you can go further in terms of measuring that clay texture. Obviously, sandy, higher sand content, it'll never ribbon at all. Loam type soils, that's more silt and silt and sand and clay in combination, will make short, broken ribbons. But as we increase that clay content, the higher the clay content, the stickier it becomes, the slicker it becomes as we add moisture. And as you can see in this illustration, when you can stick it together and it extends from your thumb and finger 2 to 3, 4 inches, the longer the ribbon, the higher the clay content. Here's that simple test that you can take some of the soil from the top portion of your landscape and put in a jar, mix a third with water, a third soil, a third water, shake it up and let it settle overnight. Obviously, the heaviest particle, biggest particles will settle out first. That'll be your sand. Next will be the silt, and then lastly will be the clay particles. And as you look to the right, you can see that off color up suspended in the water column. That's actually clay particles. So that's not the silt. That's the clay particles that stay suspended in the water because they're so light and so delicate that they're easily suspended up in that water column. If you're wanting more information about what's around your home site or possibly on your property, you can go to USDA website and look at their web soil survey and get lots of information about the soil, soil depth, soil textures, a variety of information about that property. Now, one thing that I would caution you about doing, while these are excellent tools in terms of getting information about your soil, unfortunately, depending upon where you live and how much alteration of that soil, these sites can be a little bit off, the soil maps can be a little bit off, given what may actually be there. And as you look in that bottom image there with all those houses, there's definitely been soil disturbance there. So your map may or may not be very indicative of what's there. If there's been minimal disturbance of that soil over time, the maps will be very accurate. But if there's been a lot of disturbance, those maps may be somewhat inaccurate as to what's there at your site exactly. Now, if we look in more detail in terms of what's a soil profile, and if we cut a ditch out through a soil column and looked at the different layers of that soil, basically we can break them down from an O, or the organic layer, which is that very small line right underneath the soil surface where we see the highest content of organic matter. We next move into the topsoil layer, sometimes referred to as a plow layer. This is going to be 6 to 8 inches of soil. It's going to be darker in color because, again, this is going to carry a little more organic matter to it, which is going to give it that darker color. It won't be hardly as dark as that O layer, which is just really that rich organic matter there at the surface, but it will have a lot of darkness to it because of the decaying roots and other organic matter in that soil profile. As we drop below it, you get into the B layer, the subsoil. The subsoil is going to be lighter in color. It's leach mineral silicates and clay, very little organic matter there. So depending upon what region that you're in the state of Tennessee, this could be anything from a brown to a yellow to a red, depending upon what that mineral content of your soil is. And lastly, we get into the C horizon, which would be the parent material or parent rock of what that soil was developed from. So here I live on the Cumberland Plateau. That soil actually comes from sandstone. If you were maybe down in the Central Basin, it might be limestone. So whatever that parent material is that has weathered and broken down to form the soils in your area will be that underlying rock. Now, this illustration kind of shows back what I was talking about the soil web map. Obviously, a tremendous amount of disturbance here. And so with that disturbance, our soil maps may not be very accurate at all. Some of our top soil may have been taken off, and it could either be in a pile somewhere to the right or left of this image or behind to be redistributed over the surface, or it may have been hauled off altogether. And what we're going to be working with is this soil that's remaining here, which you can see very light in color, so lower in terms of organic matter. The other thing to be concerned with is how much soil compaction is going to take place because of this soil disturbance. When we have vegetation, plants on a soil, that root system, that vegetation helps maintain the structural integrity and helps to maintain that overall structure of that soil. As we take that off and we plow or we disturb or grade these off, we destroy that structure that we see in that soil. And as a result, we can really limit the amount of water infiltration, air moving through that soil column that helps sustain life in these plants. Another very common illustration is a home site. And you can see what the other material, gravel that's been brought in, or maybe in the bottom left corner where we've mixed concrete, and how that can have an impact on not only soil pH, we see the disturbance of the soil compaction, or greater gravel in that soil column, which actually gravel really doesn't hold that much in terms of moisture, can truly impact how much water holding capacity that we can have in that soil column. So again, we think back about how much home site and construction can impact soil compaction, water infiltration, soil pH, nutrients within that soil, organic being moved away. So all things that we need to think about when we start addressing soils within our landscape. Now, I've talked about this a number of times. With a healthy soil, we're going to have structure. And so there's going to be pores and spaces through that soil column to where water and air can move down through that soil column. And the greater that structure is of that soil, the more moisture, the more air, the softer and more viable that soil is going to be to sustain life, whether it be fungi, microorganisms, or roots and plants trying to grow on the surface and their roots moving through that soil column. On a compacted soil, we see a totally different things. We see tighter spaces. We don't see the infiltration of water. We don't see the infiltration of air into that soil column. So less space is a bad thing for sustaining life, roots, plants, etc., and less water infiltration. So with less water infiltration, more runoff, and greater potential for impairment of streams. What are some other causes of compaction? Well, I've already mentioned a little bit about the soil disturbance when possibly built our homes or whatever that business was. And so with that home site construction or business construction, we can see a lot of the organic material may have been stripped away or moved, leaving a harder, more compacted subsoil that may be higher in clay contents. Rain with no vegetation can compact those soils. Just the velocity of rain striking that ground and no vegetation, or possibly vehicles and foot traffic, all can compact those soils. And one of the things that I would want to emphasize throughout this program, that if we want to sustain good structure, good soil structure and improve infiltration of water into their soil profiles, keep vegetation on it. And generally, the taller that vegetation, the more robust that vegetation, the more we're reducing the impacts of rainfall. Tall plants have tall roots, and so those roots going through the soil profile to break up and basically maintain that structural integrity of our soil profiles. So when we get compaction, what are some of the consequences? If you're a homeowner and you see a lot of standing water for extended periods of time in your front yard, backyard, side yard, or other areas as you drive down the road, if you see standing water for extended periods of time, you know there's compaction going on or some other type parent material that's limiting that water moving through the soil column. So with ponding or no infiltration, we get runoff and again, more stream impairment. So we want to try and keep as much vegetation on those sites. Taller the vegetation, the better, to help break up that soil column, to increase that structure of that soil, to help move that water through the soil column. Generally speaking, with the lawn, the shorter and tighter we mow, the more compacted those soils may become, the more they may inhibit other plant growth, the more they inhibit water moving and infiltrating into that soil column. So keeping those plants taller will help ensure that we can keep a better soil structure. Now, if you're curious, what kind of soil compaction do I have? There's some simple tests. Take one of the flagging wires and move out into your yard. Now, you're going to need some good, adequate moisture, but see how far that you can press your wire flag down in the yard. And if you can penetrate 4 to 6 inches, you've probably got good soil structure, at least in that top plow layer. If you've got good soil moisture and you can't push it down into 4 to 6 inches, then chances are you've got some major compaction going on, or at least something that's inhibiting root depth. Another method to test soil compaction is take a tin can, drive that tin can into the ground approximately 3 inches, and then fill that water or that can up with water. Now, again, we'd want to do this at a period where we had what we would consider adequate soil moisture to get a good representation of how water is going to filter into our soil profile. If it's very dry, you might need to charge at a time or two with water to kind of get that soil moisture up so you can test that infiltration. Under adequate soil moisture, when you do this test, you need to have infiltration that is at least ½ an inch per hour or better, because if you can't get a ½ an inch of water into the soil column in an hour, then you do have some type of compaction. Any type of vegetation that we have, the better, and I've mentioned this before, the stronger and more robust that vegetation is, the more it's going to improve the infiltration of water. Now, one thing that we can do if we've got compacted soils, we can add organics. Organics, a lot of times people think about improving the nutritional component of the soil, and while organics may do that a little bit, the real key to adding organics is to increase that water holding capacity. And we want that water, we want that air into the soil profile. That organic matter will allow roots to penetrate deeper. It'll help in terms of nutrient holding capacity. And so it'll help provide an overall better environment for microbial activity. And so organics are very, very, very important. Now, what kind of organics can we add? There's lots of things. Grass clippings, manure, which will decay very rapid and move into the soil profile. Compost and peat, which take a little bit more time to break down. And then there's wood chips or municipal green waste, which is where they've ground up on the side of the roads. All of those can be used. Now, some of them, the wood chips, obviously are going to be slower to break down and move into that soil column. but organic matter over time, all organic matter can serve a benefit to our soils. Now, how much organic matter should I add? Well, with gardens less than 3% organic matter, add about 2 to 3 inches and then till that in to that soil column. Let it work in. I tell people that it's very important that if you're doing like home fruit plantings, trees, things that are going to be in one space for long periods of time, put some thought into it and amend those soil areas ahead of the game and till and work that in, as well as that lime and fertilizer that you might need to help improve and actually increase the nutritional component of that soil. If I'm doing trees and shrubs, I'm going to add about 3 to 5 inches of organic matter and mix it into a foot of depth. Now, that's not just where I'm planting the tree. That's going to be the area that tree roots ultimately will grow out to. What do I expect that tree canopy, how far out will it be? That's where I want that organic matter spread out to. And in lawns, just core aerifying and top dressing once or twice a year with a 1/4 inch up to a 1/2 inch. Don't want to put so much compost that it smothers our turf, but if we core aerify it and broadcast that turf or that compost out, over time it will dramatically improve that soil's viability. We can add other inorganic amendments, perlite, vermiculite, pea gravel, sand, but now I caution people, if you've got those very heavy clay soils, don't add a lot of sand to heavy clay soils. Sand and clay make bricks. So I would encourage you to focus and concentrate on more true organic matter like leaves, sawdust, grass clippings, etc., composted material. So mulch is anything that we can apply to the surface to basically protect those tree roots or to hold moisture. And there's an array of things that we can do in terms of mulch. And any of those organic type materials that we can spread around to help conserve moisture, reduce weeds are always important. The best one I've seen is Mother Nature's idea of mulch, that dense forest floor of leaves and debris that's come off those trees that helps hold that moisture in, that over time breaks down in the soil profile. And if you've ever gone into a forested area and you kind of rake back and you see how black that organic layer is right underneath those leaves, that's Mother Nature's way of doing it. And so these lots and stuff that may be adjacent to your property, think about that before you rake them off and clean them down to the ground. Keep those leaves on there as Mother Nature's mulch. Now, we've already mentioned there's many benefits to mulch, from reducing water, reducing weed, or holds water in, reducing weeds, moderates soil temperature, so a lot of different things, even including the beauty and the aesthetic value. So mulch is really important, and I would encourage all homeowners to make a conscious effort to try and apply mulch into their landscapes. One of the biggest things, if I'm going to use mulch, is truly around some of those landscape trees, to keep those mowers and weed trimmers away from those trees and disturbing that cambium layer. And so if I'm going to mulch these trees, and you can see in that top right image there, 2 to 3 inches is all we need. And we're going to spread that mulch out to basically mirror the drip edge of those trees. So we're going to get way away from those trees, keep those mowers away from those plants, and we're going to basically focus on growing the tree and then not trying to grow grass or other vegetation in there that may struggle under that tree canopy. One thing I tell you, don't ever pile it up. No volcano mulches. You see that a lot of times. That's not good. That's a really big fire ant attractor. It can crust over. It can inhibit water and air infiltration in the soil. So no volcano mulches. Here we see with mulching flowers again, no deeper than 3 inches. Pull it back from the plants. that mulch is going to go a long way for compressing weeds, suppressing those, and holding that moisture in. Now, when we start thinking about plants, and I've mentioned this already a lot of times, putting that right plant in the right place and then trying to keep that vegetation out there to basically not only soften the raindrop, but also really build that soil column. And as you can see in that picture with the prairie grass or the turf grass, if we think about the height of that plant above the soil, basically the root depth will mirror the plant height on the surface. So tall plants, deeper roots; short plants, shallower roots. Right plant, right place, and think on growing that vegetation to help build that soil column and also lessen the impacts of rain and slowing that runoff that might impair streams. So, as we think back and look through, we've addressed many of the things that will help you move to a Tennessee Smart Yard. Each of those that we can gain an inch in terms of things that we're doing right to measure up to have that Tennessee Smart Yard. Think about your soil compaction. Go out there and do those simple tests. Use some organic material, pine straw, pine bark, or needles, whatever that case may be, to mulch those plants. And when you mulch them, make certain that we're mulching correctly in terms of 2 inches to 3 inches of depth and not overdoing it with that mulch. And then we always want to protect those soil surfaces by keeping those vegetation on there to minimize erosion, minimize water runoff, and then again have those roots build that soil column and improve that soil structure to overall improve infiltration and that environmental life for those fungi, bacteria, and roots trying to grow in that soil profile. If you've got any other questions, we encourage you to contact your local UT TSU Extension offices. The county ag agents will be glad to visit with you about any of these concepts in terms of improving soil, in terms of plant selection. You can also go to UT Hort. We have an array of publications that talk about turf grasses and garden vegetables and other information that you might find useful. We hope that you've enjoyed this segment of the Tennessee Smart Yards, and we'll continue checking out our other segments and those 9 principles for a Tennessee Smart Yard.